Before the city even woke up, one shaky porch video outran every press release Minneapolis could have issued. A porch bulb glowing against the dark, frozen breath hanging in the air, a tiny backpack left on the concrete like it had been dropped mid-thought, and a child, too small for the jacket swallowing his shoulders, standing unnaturally still, as if staying motionless was the only safe decision his body could make. Adults moved around him in frantic bursts. Someone reached in, someone hesitated. The phone dipped, recovered, dipped again. It was under 30 seconds, but it hit like the kind of footage that doesn't stay local. In the middle of that frame was a 5-year-old boy being taken during an immigration enforcement action. No sirens tearing through the neighborhood, no chase down an alley, no door kicked in, no broken glass, just federal procedure, cold, organized, and fast, unfolding on a quiet street that never imagined it would become a national talking point. The child's face only surfaced in fragments, but his confusion didn't need a close-up. He didn't understand why unfamiliar hands were guiding him away, why voices sharpened, why the morning suddenly felt dangerous. By the time local stations picked it up, the internet had already decided what it meant. For some, it looked like an unforgivable line crossed. For others, it looked like enforcement with no brakes. Officials responded in the safest possible sentences. The child had been temporarily placed under protective supervision during a lawful action. Procedures were followed. No additional information would be provided. But it was the missing information that made the moment impossible to ignore. Because this wasn't some accidental sweep that caught the wrong address. That house had been marked. The hour was chosen. The teams moved like they'd already walked the scene 100 times. Unmarked vehicles held their positions at the ends of the block. A second unit sat on the perimeter, watching for movement that never came. Nothing about it had the feel of improvisation. It felt like a scheduled extraction. And within a few hours, the story split cleanly into two realities. On the surface, Minneapolis locked onto the child. Outrage-filled timelines. Clips slowed down, zoomed in, captioned like evidence in a trial. Community leaders demanded explanations. Calls for protests spread. Reporters asked questions and got the same clipped response on repeat. But beneath the noise, the federal side moved in the opposite direction, and faster. Because the detention didn't begin a case, it activated one. The boy mattered not because of who he was, but because of who he was connected to. His father was Yusuf Abdullahi, 52, well known across Minnesota. In public, he looked like the exact kind of figure cities like to showcase. Measured, composed, photographed beside officials, praised as a bridge between government offices and the Somali community. In a place that runs on narratives, he was a convenient one, a mediator, a success story, a man who could calm a room with a single call. That morning, the porch video didn't just pull a child from a doorstep. It cracked the armor around a man people treated like he couldn't be touched. And men like that don't get touched by accident. By late morning, sealed documents were moving through federal channels with a speed that didn't match a routine case. The situation jumped categories. It became multi-agency. Data requests went out under emergency status. Analysts were reassigned mid-shift. Coordination calls formed between units that usually didn't sit at the same table unless something bigger was already taking shape. Outside, crowds gathered and cameras waited. Inside, the task force didn't argue about optics. It started hunting structure. Early afternoon brought the first real pull from the devices taken during the initial action. And what came out didn't resemble community work, charity planning, or harmless outreach. It read like operations, time windows, routes, transfers disguised as normal movement, names that never appeared in any public story, inventory numbers that belonged nowhere in legitimate business. The signal wasn't loud. It was disciplined. Messages referenced locations in shorthand. Instructions were written in language that sounded meaningless unless you already knew what to match it against. Photos showed sealed packages that could pass as ordinary freight. Notes that looked harmless on their own, but shifted into something else once investigators layered them over what they already suspected. One cluster hit harder than the rest. It wasn't mapping conversation, it was mapping motion. Where something was staged, where it paused, where it switched hands, and where it vanished. From there, everything widened like a lens snapping into focus. A warehouse lease outside the city traced back to a shell company tied through relatives. A logistics contractor named on invoices didn't exist in any state database. A nonprofit branded as community development had been sending payments to businesses sharing addresses with vacant storefronts and locked doors. Then finance analysts ran the flow, and it was even cleaner. Thousands of transfers, small enough to stay under reporting thresholds, boring enough to avoid attention. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just steady movement, designed never to spike. Laundering engineered to look like paperwork. And paperwork is how networks survive. Field teams started checking the names orbiting Yusuf's world. Some came back clean, almost too clean. Others carried histories that didn't fit the public image. People linked to older trafficking investigations. Couriers caught once and quietly released. Brokers showing up repeatedly near seizures across multiple states, while staying outside formal case files. Then the match landed. A string of serial signatures pulled off a single device, matched a Midwest firearms file that never officially closed, just went cold, buried under years of stalled paperwork. The alignment wasn't a fluke, it was architecture. A long-running corridor built to survive by staying quiet, staying scheduled, staying clean enough to pass as routine. And suddenly the truth locked into place. What the public called a scandal wasn't the main event. It was the access point. The child being taken wasn't the finish line. It was force applied. And force doesn't just reveal people. It makes systems flinch. That was all federal units needed. Not outrage, not a moral debate, not a headline. They needed the network to react, to shift positions, send warnings, reroute, delete, replace. A living structure can't resist moving when it senses pressure. And movement tells investigators more than any press briefing ever will. The city watched a child at the center of a storm. The task force saw something else entirely. A protected machine blinking for the first time. As the evening closed in, the polished public image of Yusuf Abdullahi began to fracture. Not because anyone had stood at a microphone and accused him, but because the evidence forming behind the scenes wasn't a theory. It was a map. Not gossip, but linkages. A chain connecting people who never appeared together in public, bound by routes, coded numbers, timed windows, and quiet protection. The most unsettling part wasn't that a network like this could exist. It was that it had lasted without living underground. It had disguised itself inside trust, inside status, routine, grant language, nonprofit signage, and the lazy assumption that legitimacy must be real if the paperwork looks correct. That night, federal command circled one time block for the next phase, just before sunrise. It wouldn't be a press conference, it would be synchronization, an operation designed to collapse the structure before it could scatter. Because the case had already moved past the optics of a child on a porch. Investigators were staring at something much larger, a system moving weapons and narcotics through Minnesota while wearing legitimacy like armor. And the moment that cracked the door open had already happened, quietly, on a porch, in the cold, with a small backpack left on the concrete, like proof that something hidden had finally surfaced. At 3:19 a.m., Minneapolis lay still in the way cities only do when everyone believes nothing truly serious happens until morning. But inside a secured operations center outside the metro, the night was already active. The screens weren't tracking protests or social media. They were tracking routes, leases, device pings, payment flows, a lattice of nodes so clean it couldn't have formed by accident. And in the center sat the name that triggered the escalation in the first place, Yusuf Abdullahi. The task force wasn't chasing a personality, it was chasing a corridor, a structure that moved product the way legitimate companies move freight, on schedules, through safe windows, protected by paperwork and silence. At 3:31 a.m., the first green light went out. No sirens, no convoy staging in plain sight. Speed and surprise mattered more than volume, because one premature signal, one wrong flash of lights, one rumor on the right phone, would make the whole network evaporate. Devices would disappear, vehicles would reroute, evidence would dissolve into fresh layers of normal. At 3:38 a.m., unmarked units rolled out from 3 separate lots. Headlights stayed low until the last turns. Radio traffic was clipped to bare essentials, and the targets didn't look like cartel strongholds. On paper, they looked boring. A warehouse registered as a maintenance distributor, a rented duplex held under a property trust, a storefront office with a nonprofit logo in the window, a detached garage behind a quiet residential house. This wasn't a network hiding in darkness. It was hiding inside normal. At 3:45 a.m., the first breach hit the warehouse. A steel service door buckled inward under controlled force. Agents moved fast into aisles of generic cartons and shrink-wrapped stacks. The front rows looked like exactly what the building claimed to be. The back section did not. Overwrapped pallets, tape patterns consistent with concealment methods, a wrap station that still held warmth in its rollers, and torn shipping paperwork stamped with 2 words meant to kill curiosity on contact: community relief. At 3:47 a.m., the second team entered the duplex. It wasn't a home, it was a staging room. Chargers lined up in a neat row like a rack system. SIM cards separated into sleeves. A laptop sat open to a routing interface, secured before it could lock. On the table was a notebook packed with totals and initials. No full names, no explanations. And across multiple pages, the same phrase appeared again and again: delay window approved. That wasn't about late deliveries. That was about safe movement. The gaps where inspections were quiet and cameras had already looked away. At 3:52 a.m., an interdiction unit caught the first moving piece. A cargo van left a residential block at the exact minute analysts predicted. No speeding, no aggressive turns. It moved with careful restraint, choosing side streets that only made sense to someone trained to avoid attention, not chase time. The stop wasn't theatrical. The van was boxed in, angles cut, turning options removed. Within seconds, it was still. The driver had no weapon, no cash, nothing obvious. That was the strategy. The guilt was distributed across the structure, so no single piece looked criminal on its own. But the floor told a different story. Compartments cut into the van's frame, plates painted to match factory coatings, a set of tools in the glove box built for fast removal, and underneath, sealed inventory packed like it belonged in a warehouse, not on the street. Vacuum-compressed bricks, sleeved bundles, moisture packs tucked in like quality control, labels reduced to numeric codes. At 4:06 a.m., teams stopped reporting how much. They started reporting what? Compressed narcotics, weapon assemblies, packaging stock, encrypted hardware, cash blocks. At 4:11 a.m., the case expanded again when agents entered the storefront office listed under nonprofit outreach. From the sidewalk, it looked harmless. Flyers taped to the glass, a donation box near the counter, warm paint, soft lighting, language built to calm people down. Everything about the front room said community. The back room said something else, a deadbolt, then another. Inside, it wasn't charity, it was command infrastructure. Router towers stacked like a server cage, signal repeaters staged for deployment, phones preloaded and sealed in plastic like disposable tools, a contact directory built out of nicknames, number strings, and dates, an entire relationship network disguised as casual fragments. And behind a false wall panel were flat vacuum packs of cash, each bundle identical, each amount sitting just beneath federal reporting thresholds. This wasn't a one-time disguise. This was permanent architecture. At 4:20 a.m., analysts watched the board change in real time. Nodes began disappearing. Phones went dark. Vehicles stopped pinging. Payment lanes froze. The network didn't just lose items, it lost synchronization. And that difference mattered. A raid seizes product. A takedown fractures the system that keeps product moving. At 4:33 a.m., teams hit storage units on the city's edge. Registered under business names that didn't exist, accessed through rotating schedules designed to avoid patterns. A lock snapped. The door rolled up. The first layer was staged to look boring. Auto parts, household storage, general supplies. Behind it sat sealed crates with foam inserts cut so precisely they looked manufactured for metal. Rifle components, optic mounts, ammunition cases, not complete weapons, pieces. Moved in fragments to reduce detection, increase deniability, and survive routine stops with clean paperwork. This corridor had been engineered to pass through ordinary life. At 4:48 a.m., command asked the question that would decide everything that followed. Where's the center? The answer didn't arrive as a confession. It arrived as routine. A seized calendar entry titled like a community meeting. The address was a private residence outside Minneapolis. And the attendees weren't public officials or donors. They were names that kept appearing across seized data. Couriers, brokers, intermediaries, people who never showed up on camera, but always showed up in logistics. At the bottom, a small note sat like an afterthought. 2 words, route reset. And that changed the temperature of the entire operation, because it meant the structure was about to move. Immediately, the porch moment had done what pressure always does. It forced reaction. It pushed the corridor to reposition before the full map could be drawn. At 5:02 a.m., Federal Command collapsed the timeline. No waiting, no later. The objective shifted in one sentence, from collection to collapse. By 5:18 a.m., reinforcements were pulled from regional offices. Emergency authorizations moved through the system at speed. The operation was no longer confined to one city, not for theater, but because the corridor demanded a wider net. Outside, the public was still trapped in the same argument, the same clip, the same outrage, the same debate over what the moment looked like. Inside the task force, the next strike window was already written in thick black marker, just before dawn, because the evidence had become impossible to deny. Weapons disguised as components, narcotics disguised as freight, money disguised as charity. A structure built to live in plain sight, now forced to shift under pressure. And pressure was exactly what Command intended to deliver next. By the second night, the public narrative still sounded simple. A child had been taken during an enforcement action. A neighborhood erupted. Videos spread. Commentators took sides. Officials repeated carefully engineered sentences. Every conversation stayed stuck at street level, where the event looked like an error. But inside the operation, the child was no longer the focus. Because the child wasn't what made this dangerous. The father was. Not because he looked like a criminal, because he looked like the opposite. Yusuf Abdullahi had spent years building something stronger than intimidation. He built credibility. He didn't need threats or muscle. His protection came from perception, from calm voice, clean suit, controlled posture, the right introductions, the right photos, the right rooms. He showed up at school board meetings and city roundtables. He appeared at charity dinners and public safety briefings. He posted smiling photos beside officials and wrote thank you captions about partnership and progress. Local coverage used safe words: leader, advocate, bridge builder. That image didn't just create respect, it created access. Access to buildings, access to calendars, access to people who stopped asking hard questions because asking felt rude. And that was the first truth investigators locked onto. This wasn't a network surviving by avoiding institutions. It was surviving by occupying them. By noon the following day, analysts had reconstructed Yusuf's routine into a working map. Not just where he showed up, but what shifted after he left. Every meeting turned into a junction. Every handshake opened a passage. Every quick call became a delay somewhere else in the system. And the pattern kept repeating with a consistency that felt too smooth to be coincidence. A warehouse inspection rescheduled due to staffing. A permit issue resolved with unnatural speed. A complaint quietly withdrawn without explanation. A security camera work order approved the same week a sensitive shipment passed through. One by one, each detail looked innocent. Stacked together, they looked like coverage. Then the finance reconstruction came back. And it wasn't simple greed, it was worse. Because it wasn't sloppy, it was designed. The money never moved in one obvious hit. It moved in shavings, thousands of small transfers engineered to feel boring. Consulting fees, event coordination, transportation reimbursements, non-profit program expenses, project costs, service invoices. Every line item dressed like normal life. But when investigators followed the flow, the strategy became unmistakable. Funds hopped across state lines through accounts that changed names but kept the same pulse. They cycled through shell companies tied to relatives. They passed through storefronts that existed only on paper. Then they came back around as rent payments, property leases, and community development contracts that never produced a real outcome. The money wasn't just hidden, it was turned into routine. And routine allowed 2 operations to run at the same time, without touching on the surface. One operation was public, leadership, outreach, charity work, political relationships, media praise. The other operation was the real one, weapons and narcotics, not sold in alleyways, moved like freight. The weapons weren't transported as complete rifles. They moved as parts, boxes labeled as hardware, spare components, mechanical pieces. Nothing that screamed weapon on a quick glance. Enough to remain deniable if intercepted. Enough to be assembled later, far away from the paper trail that carried them. The narcotics didn't arrive in gym bags and street packaging. They arrived vacuum sealed, desiccant-packed, palletized beside legitimate freight, routed through warehouses and storage units under names that never repeated twice. A supply chain designed to look like commerce. And the most important element wasn't speed, it was timing. That's where Yusuf Abdullahi's true value surfaced. He didn't need to touch the product, he touched the schedule. Investigators found notes and route windows aligning with moments when scrutiny softened, periods when enforcement attention shifted elsewhere, when specific inspectors weren't working, when city noise was loud enough to blur detail, when the corridor could move without pressure. He wasn't a cartel boss in the traditional sense. He was a traffic controller, a man who understood which questions would be asked, who would ask them, and how to ensure those questions arrived late, after the van was gone, after the unit was empty, after the handoff had already happened. Once that structure came into focus, teams began building out the ground layer that kept it functioning. A broker who handled leases under rotating LLCs, a coordinator who managed route resets and timing windows, a courier system that cycled vehicles before patterns could form, an enforcement tier responsible for discipline when anything went wrong. And above them sat Yusuf, not as a loud commander, not as a street figure, as the stabilizer, the one who kept the machine running so smoothly that nobody felt the urgency to stop it. Then the case pivoted again. Because the task force uncovered proof Yusuf wasn't simply benefiting from the corridor. He was selling protection as a product, not protection through threats, protection through influence. Seized ledgers and recovered notes revealed a fee structure, not written like a menu, but recorded in shorthand, categories, initials, repeated amounts too consistent to be accidental. A permit problem could disappear for 5 figures. A delayed inspection carried a smaller cost. A warning call before a visit had its own price. A camera outage, scheduled at the right time, was more expensive. This wasn't corruption inside a courtroom. It was corruption inside routine. The system wasn't being beaten from the outside. It was being softened from the inside, until it stopped acting like a barrier and started acting like a service lane. And the worst part was how clean it looked on paper. Every transfer had a reason. Every invoice had a label. Every payment stayed small enough to avoid automatic alarms. In spreadsheets, it looked like community development. In reality, it was corridor maintenance. By late afternoon, command reached the moment every long investigation eventually hits, the decision point. They could keep collecting, slowly, patiently, watching the network breathe, building a case with time on their side. But time was no longer on their side. The porch moment forced the structure to respond. It was already adapting. Routes were being rewritten. Phones were going silent. Names were rotating. The corridor was learning in real time. And time itself became the network's last defense. A defense paid for over years, not with one big payoff, but with a long sequence of small purchases, tiny transfers, delayed oversight, polite silence. That social hesitation people feel when the person being questioned is labeled a leader. So the task force chose one option: collapse. Not a strike for headlines. A shutdown aimed at what mattered, not what looked dramatic. Warehouses, storage units, handoff vehicles, cash rooms, device hubs, and one location that kept reappearing in the data trail like a pulse. A private home outside the city. A reset point. A coordination room. A place that never appeared on public calendars, yet sat at the center of the corridor's rhythm, like a heartbeat. By then, the father's role wasn't speculation, it was diagrammed. And once a diagram exists, there's only one question left: when? That night, command finished the plan around a single rule. No single target matters if the corridor survives. So the operation wouldn't resemble a raid. It would resemble structural failure, a synchronized shutdown designed to remove routes, devices, cache, and people inside the same window, before the network could inhale and scatter. By midnight, teams were already positioned across multiple counties, vehicles topped off, evidence units staged, interdiction points preset, air support briefed, then held in reserve, radios tested once, then quieted. And while Minneapolis stayed locked in argument over the porch clip that started the fire, investigators prepared to show what had been living underneath it the entire time. Not a mistake, not an accident. A system built to hide inside trust. And now, finally, a system about to be dragged into daylight. At 12:26 a.m., the case switched modes. Investigation ended. shutdown began. No sirens, no press pool, no visible buildup. The goal was simple: take the corridor apart before it could breathe again. Teams moved in parallel across Minnesota and into 2 neighboring states, hitting the network where it actually lived. Not in speeches, not in rumors, but in infrastructure. Warehouses, storage sites, vehicle handoffs, device hubs. At 12:41 a.m., the first wave hit the industrial edge of Minneapolis. Steel doors gave under controlled force. Flashlights carved through long concrete aisles. Agents didn't hunt drama, they hunted function. Pallets labeled as ordinary household freight were peeled back to reveal vacuum-sealed narcotics, staged for immediate movement. Packaging stations still held heat. Labels were clean, generic, untraceable. The process was precise. Minutes later, interdiction units closed on 2 vehicles already rolling. Both drivers did the same thing. No panic, no speed, no weapons visible. The discipline was the tell. The compartments told the rest. Inside, sealed bricks, encrypted radio gear, and parts kits designed to look harmless until assembled somewhere else. By 1:09 a.m., storage sites started failing one after another. Units rented under rotating LLC names opened to crates of weapon components, ammunition, serialized parts. Each piece nested in foam inserts, cut with manufacturing-level accuracy. No flash, just volume. Enough to supply a violent tier without ever needing to buy locally. At 1:22 a.m., the network's communications began to die. Phones dropped off the grid. Repeaters went dark. Payment lanes froze. Inside a storefront still labeled Community Outreach, agents seized the core device rack. The cover didn't matter anymore. The machine was losing coordination in real time. At 1:37 a.m., teams hit the reset residence. Fast entry, controlled movement, final outcome. Inside was what investigators needed most: ledgers, routing notes, stacks of burners, cash packs split into identical amounts, always kept under reporting thresholds. Proof this wasn't chaos, it was engineering. By 2:10 a.m., the corridor stopped functioning. Couriers were in custody. Warehouses were locked down. Cash was secured. Weapon flow was cut off before it could move again. And the center, Yusuf Abdullahi, was no longer a public figure protected by reputation. He was a node removed from the system. At sunrise, Command issued the first internal summary. Tens of millions in narcotics seized, hundreds of weapons and components recovered, dozens of encrypted devices collected, route architecture dismantled in a single night. But the real damage wasn't measured in bricks or cash. It was measured in silence. Because the case didn't just expose a criminal network, it exposed how easily a structure can hide inside trust, how legitimacy can become camouflage, how routine can be weaponized, until the systems meant to protect communities start quietly serving the people exploiting them. The porch clip sparked outrage. What followed revealed something worse: a corridor designed to survive in plain sight, until pressure finally forced it into the light.